Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CPPR's dialogue on the intersection of climate change and gender in India's coastal region. I'm Alina Desaku, Research Associate in the International Relations Vertical of CPPR and moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is the first one in a webinar series as part of a research project titled Indian Coastal Think Tank Network, supported by the Asia Foundation, New Delhi. The Indian Coastal Think Tank Network, or ICTN as we call it, aims to create a network of coastal think tanks focused on policy-driven analysis of issues in India's coastal region from local, regional, and national perspectives. We have 9 different experts joining us in this network from different think tanks and institutions across coastal states in India, focusing on the following themes, such as climate change and gender, coastal security, blue economy, fisheries, coastal ecology, tourism, maritime domain awareness, ports and shipping, and disaster management. Members of the network engage in producing research papers and have dialogues with each other on coastal issues in India. The research findings will then be presented at a conference to be held in Kochi, and a compendium of the papers is to be published. And this project is supported by the Asia Foundation. And joining us here today, we have Manvi Tripathi, Program Officer at Asia Foundation. Thank you so much, Manvi, for joining us. Please let us know your thoughts about the project and the thematic areas we have selected for today's webinar.
Hi, thanks, Alina. Good morning, everybody. It's my privilege to be here at this important discussion on the intersection of climate change and gender in India's coastal region. As we gather here today, we are reminded of the growing urgency to address the profound and multifaceted impacts of climate change, particularly on vulnerable communities. As Alina has rightly pointed out, the Asia Foundation, in collaboration with CPPR, has launched the India Coastal Think Tank Network, a strategic initiative to address critical challenges and opportunities in the Indian Ocean region. The project seeks to foster a coalition of multiple coastal think tanks and to establish a robust research framework on coastal issues and facilitate knowledge sharing among stakeholders. Through this collaborative approach, ICTN aims to generate actionable recommendations to tackle both traditional and non-traditional challenges in the region. And I'm very pleased to be here at the very first webinar in the series. Coastal areas, homes to millions, are on the front line of this crisis, and rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation are not just altering landscapes, but are deeply affecting livelihoods, health, and social structures. Among these challenges, women often face the greatest burdens due to pre-existing gender inequalities, limited access to resources, and their critical role in maintaining households and communities. Today, we are fortunate to have an esteemed panel of experts who will shed light on these pressing issues, and they'll explore how climate change worsens vulnerabilities for women, highlight the resilience and leadership women demonstrate in these challenging environments, and discuss pathways for inclusive and sustainable solutions. This conversation is not just about identifying problems, but also about fostering actionable insights that can guide policy, drive local initiatives, and inspire global cooperation. With that, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise and experience today, and to CPPR for hosting this webinar. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Alina.
Thank you, Manvi, for having to set the perfect context for the webinar. Now, before we get into the conversation, I would like to introduce you to our amazing panelists for the day. Dr. Dhanasri. Dr. Dhanasri Jairam is a Senior Assistant Professor, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, and Co-Coordinator, Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, India. She is also a Research Fellow, Center for Public Policy Research, India, Research Fellow, Earth System Governance Alliance, Member, Climate Security Expert Network, Non-Resident Fellow, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Visiting Fellow, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, India, Associate Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, Hiroshima University. She was a research fellow at Center Mark Bloch and guest researcher at Freie University at Berlin under the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation's International Climate Protection Fellowship in 2022 and 23. She pursued a visiting fellowship, Erasmus, at Leiden University, the Netherlands, in 2014 and 15. And a postdoctoral fellowship at University of Lausanne, Switzerland, under the Swiss government's Excellence Scholarships in 2018-19. Dr. Dhanasri's areas of research include environmental and climate security, climate diplomacy, environmental geopolitics in Southern Asia, Indo-Pacific and polar regions, gender and climate governance, and geopolitical security implications of solar geoengineering. I welcome you, ma'am, to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Adina, for having me in this webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. So to join on the conversation, we have Ms. Sanakshi Saluja. Ms. Sanakshi Saluja, an economist by training, is currently a research manager, climate adaptation at National Institute of Urban Affairs. She holds an experience of 10 years working in the climate change and energy sector, cross-cutting through social and policy research and gender analysis. She's been awarded various fellowships, including the Professional Fellows for Governance and Society by the U.S. Department of State and International Climate Protection Fellowship by Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. Welcome, Sonakshi.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you, CPPR and Asia Foundation for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Sonakshi. I'm sure we'll have an engaging discussion again. Now, before we begin, I would like to remind our viewers that you can put your questions in the YouTube comment box, which we'll be taking up towards the end of the session. Now, to begin with, I would like to start with the basics to gain more perspectives on the coastal areas in India and the challenges faced by women in the coastal areas. So, Dr. Dansri, given that India has a very unique geography, the issues faced by women in coastal areas can also be different from each other, essentially between region to region and state to state as well. So, how does the unique geography of India's coastal regions exacerbate the climate vulnerabilities for women? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alina, for the question. And I think Manvi has already laid out, the foundation for the discussion by talking about why gender vulnerabilities matter, especially when we are discussing coastal security in a very broad sense. And also, it is important that, as part of this project, which I'm very glad CPPR and Asia Foundation have taken up this task of setting up this coastal network and looking at wide range of sectors, maritime domain awareness, blue economy, disaster preparedness. And if you look at any of these sectors, it's important to also look at the cross-cutting sectors of climate and gender, because climate and gender have far-reaching implications for all of them. So I think in that sense, it's good to see that CPPR and Asia Foundation have decided to start this whole webinar series with the focus on climate and gender, the intersection of climate and gender itself, because that would give us a broad idea of what are the major issues. Now, coming to your specific question on climate change vulnerabilities in India's coastal regions, and then how do they really have gender implications, or how does that affect gender in a differentiated manner? We know that, of course, coastal regions are highly vulnerable to climate change. We know that, especially recent studies have pointed at many different vulnerabilities. Of course, the rising sea levels is one, but also if you look at even the oceans heating up and how that is also influencing the patterns of cyclones in both Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea is something that we have to look out for. And we also know climate models show that the oceans are going to further heat up in the future as well. The Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, for instance, has come up with this study. So, of course, this doesn't mean that all the coastal areas in India, and also we have islands of Andaman and Nicobar Islands and Lakshadweep, which also have their own specific vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change. And I mentioned some of those, but how do they really interact with gender? And I think what Manvi mentioned in the beginning about how, specific roles, like for women, or gender specific roles, responsibilities, they already sort of accentuate these inequalities that already exist between men and women. Of course, there are specific issues of concern, for instance, climate migration is one, which I will come to later, but also in terms of land erosion, economic decline, because if you look at specifically like island states of India, you would see that the economies of these islands are more dependent as such on sectors like tourism, etc., which are even more dependent on, which are even more vulnerable to climate change. Similarly, you look at the agricultural decline, particularly due to, not just because of land erosion, but also about saltwater intrusion, etc., and also flooding, tidal floods, which are also specific problems that are faced by many of the states along both the eastern and the western coast, and also the island states. we know that these have already affected the economies of these states. But these kind of affect the island states even more because there are other economic possibilities, for instance, in the mainland, where you can also look at diversification of employment opportunities. You can also look at, how, migratory patterns could be managed in a way that could also help the women cope with these changes. But essentially, when we talk about gender-related issues, the fact of the matter is mainly because of the roles and responsibilities. There are a lot of additional burden. There is a lot of additional burden that is usually put on women in terms of carers, in terms of carrying, say, water. Like this is something that we have seen in some of the states where saltwater intrusion or salinity particularly has forced women to walk even farther to collect water for the entire family. It's also about migration of men to other parts of the country, leaving the women behind, which also leads to additional burdens on the women. Sometimes it's also that women, once the males migrate, the women are not heard enough within the societies that that they inhabit. The traditional roles particularly have a lot of impact on this. And also much often what also happens is that women don't have access to social protection schemes because their work is not recognized. There is complementarity when you're looking at the fishing sector, for instance. It's not just, of course, we look at it as a very male sort of sector where males go out into the sea and and fish. But the fact of the matter is there is a complementarity where the women are particularly doing the work of drying the fish, for instance, or marketing, and these kind of activities are carried out by women, which also gets affected when, say, there is less fish stock in the sea, or when you're not allowed to go out to fish in the seas, particularly due to the cyclones, etc. So that also leads to more economic precarity for women who are also dependent on the same sector, yet their work is not recognized enough, which also leads to the lack of access to much of the social protection schemes or financial schemes which help cope with climate change in a big way. So this is one thing, but also in terms of, you look at, in terms of evacuation, I mean, a lot has improved in recent times, but we have also seen that in the evacuation time when there is an impending disaster, sometimes it is difficult for women to get, to have access to these, if you look at the tsunami, for instance, much earlier, we have seen how many women found it very difficult because they felt closer to the family. They wanted to rescue their children, family before saving themselves. So in that sense, there is also this social norms which have prevented women from or having that access to various rescue missions and other things. So these are some of the things, but also I can, I will reflect upon some of the other issues like healthcare facilities, because this again, we have seen like, in the recent times as well, whenever the cyclone hits and the healthcare facilities also get affected. And this is also particularly important in the island states where you see that healthcare facilities are not as well developed, say in the mainland. So when a disaster strikes, or when there are health related concerns due to climate change which affect women disproportionately, especially pregnant women, for instance, there is a lack of access to healthcare facilities as well that they face. And last but not the least, I should also probably emphasize the fact that there is also gender-based violence that comes with, especially you're looking at even say in the in the rehabilitation centers or evacuation centers, there are also concerns about gender-based violence and the kind of problems women face. There are also studies which indicate that women who have been or women or girls who don't have access to education, or when they are displaced from their traditional livelihoods, and when they are when they are displaced from their traditional households itself, closer to the coast. So there are all these concerns which kind of put emphasis on the fact that we need to look at gender and climate change as a cross-cutting theme in all our policies, and especially when we are looking at climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction policies in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanasri. I think it is a very comprehensive analysis of how gender as well as climate change is essential and is a cross-cutting issue to all things such as healthcare or violence or be it economy or be it agriculture. So now we'll move on to the second question to Ms. Sonakshi. How do you define the intersection of climate change and gender, and why is it crucial to address both the issues together, particularly in developing nations?
So, am I audible? Yeah, I guess. So, already Dhanashree and Manvi have set up the table, and I'm almost like risking repeating everything. So I'm still going to say it because it's very essential. This work that I'm going to present, or the answers that I'm coming across from, are preliminary work of the team I'm part of at NIUA, and we have been working on assessing impact of climate vulnerabilities on gender in India through these literature reviews. So there's already quite a dearth of studies assessing these impacts on gender. It is very important to understand that climate change has differentiated impact across different genders. Now we are concentrating on specifically women and men for assessing the vulnerabilities. But the underlying argument is that these varied impacts, whether in developing nations, are due to our inherent societal setup, which is very patriarchal in nature, and the gender norms and roles for both men and women in most part of the country are still have very well-defined lines and rules, like you have to follow them. So traditional, as Dhanashree already mentioned, that traditional societal structures assign women the primary role of a caregiver or a homemaker and a nurturer. So they are restricted in the house. Cultural norms in India prevent women's access to education and basic life skills such as driving, swimming, bicycle riding. We do not, when we were growing up as women in India and other developing nations, I'm sure, this was not part of our growing up as well. There was a long journey to reach this equality to begin with. Even women's conservative clothing restricts movement because of the tailoring or length of fabric that is used. A coastal study actually conducted in urban slums in Andhra Pradesh showed that due to gender-specific traditional wear, women were more vulnerable than men and also had a higher death rate when a coastal disaster strikes. Additionally, there's a limited financial management skill. A lot of women, I mean, we are still privileged, but a lot of women do not have control over their own earnings in developing nations. So women and children are often kept away from understanding finances. While it is very natural to feel overwhelmed with money management, but we are constantly told money is a complicated issue. Like, stay away. We are kept away from that room where money is being counted or something like that. And thus, especially for building climate resilience in developing nations, financial independence is important. It is imperative for women of all ages and all demography to understand that investments and money management are very, very important part of coping up with climate change and pre- and post-disaster preparedness and risk reduction.
Thank you, Sonakshi. I think it was crucial that we address issues that are important in terms of cultural as well as in terms of financial issues. So now we'll move on to another major issue which Dr. Dhanasri has spoken before, but on a very little basis, that is on migration. So this is a major theme to look at, and in this there are a couple of questions that needs to be addressed, such as the various pattern differences between men and women in terms of migration, and how does their traditional gender role affects migration. Most importantly, how does the migration of men affect the women who stay behind in coastal areas?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest questions when it comes to dealing with climate migration. As of now, we don't have any robust policies or regulations that deal with climate migration. And I think to start with, we need to think about climate migration in a more comprehensive way before we can also talk about how do we make this policy also gender responsive. So we need to start from thinking about what types of climate migration exist in India right now, especially in the coastal areas, that we are seeing large scale migration happening from coastal areas to interior, less climate vulnerable areas. And I think one of the biggest issues with migration is that, of course, there is planned relocation that could be thought of. Odisha, for instance, is looking at some of these possibilities already. Rehabilitations, in terms of bringing them to less climate vulnerable, families to less climate vulnerable regions, which means you are bringing the entire family to another less climate vulnerable region, and not just the males really migrating. But we have seen in terms of numbers, it's the males who are migrating in much greater numbers from the coastal areas to interior, especially urban centers, for jobs, and that is primarily the reason for migration is still like economic diversification and looking for better jobs, because fishing is becoming or coastal economies are sort of declining, or that the fishing is becoming much more difficult, especially with climate related disasters, and also many other reasons, especially in the Bay of Bengal region. This is becoming a much acute problem today. So what are the different factors to look at when you are, focusing on gender-specific vulnerabilities? Again, some of the issues that Sonakshi also mentioned about traditional roles or traditional societal structures, the lack of decision-making power, these are all concerns which continue to affect, migratory patterns also, that women are not necessarily encouraged to move from the more climate vulnerable regions, because they have to look after the family, they have to look after the assets, houses, or whatever the land they have. So they are left to look after these these entities and family and etc. But the men sort of move to urban centers for better jobs. Now, the fact is that and what happens is that, of course, this leads to the creation of female-headed households. Now, female-headed households, may not mean that females really have the power to make decision-making, or make decisions at the household level or at the community level or societal level either, because we have seen, for instance, in some of the studies, they clearly point out the fact that much of these women, of course, derive their income from informal sources like agriculture, which are equally vulnerable to climate change. So coastal agriculture, once that gets affected, and of course, like I mentioned about the complementarity, right? So men and women are equally employed by the fishing sector. So once the men migrate to other parts of the country or somewhere else, women also lose their jobs, because there's no fish that is being caught, right? So then in that sense, it also affects the women's economic independence to a large extent. So it's that's one of the factors that needs to be understood. And even when we're looking at resettlement policies or resettlement initiatives, there are studies which also show that the women, for instance, who've been responsible for looking after livestock, they have to leave the livestock behind in the coastal areas and come to this new place where they're resettled. And sometimes they cannot really, they don't have any diversification that they can do in terms of employment. The men may find jobs, but the women still, they cannot find any jobs, or they cannot practice any agriculture, because the soil, the soils are not as fertile, or soils are not the same as what they had been practicing in the coastal area. So there is also the reskilling that needs to be done, or the new geography needs to be understood. And of course, uprooting, cultural uprooting is something very critical as well, because you have your ancestors, and you have lived in a place for a long time, and then you are moving into a completely new area where you may have to learn something new. And also, as I said, education is another factor, because very often when resettlement happens, there is a problem also with what kind of education you have access to. And there are also, in fact, some studies which show that the female-headed households, particularly when the resettlement happens, because they are economically not as well off as the male-led households, sometimes they're not even able to build the houses in the resettled area, or they are not, it's a half-built houses that they have to inhabit then. So there are issues in terms of the economic, that as Sonakshi mentioned, these structural sort of issues will also affect how well you can rehabilitate women in the new wherever they are resettled. So yeah, overall, these are some of the issues that come in the way of gender responsive climate adaptation. And policies have evolved to some extent, but the problem is it hasn't evolved to the extent because, as I said, there is so less recognition of climate migration itself in the country, like, except in a few places. This is something that needs to be studied further, like, what are the drivers of migration? How does it then, affect women disproportionately? Are women also migrating or not? Because the numbers clearly say that, it's less than 10% women who actually migrate from the climate vulnerable coastal areas. And like around 40% men are actually migrating from some of these vulnerable areas. So then in that sense, there is a clear disparity. So this also affects economies. It also affects, it also affects, the society as a whole, because as Sonakshi also said, like, this is something that, this is like a community level adaptation. So women are the ones that, lead their families, and, they lead community adaptation at that level. And if women are not empowered enough, it also happens that, they're just left behind, and, their drudgery increases, where they just have to find some or other jobs, on a regular basis, which is not, very positive sort of, way of adaptation. Yeah.
All right, ma'am. So now, since we've looked at a very comprehensive way through climate change, gender, and how this has, effects in terms of agriculture or economy or in terms of migration, I think it's important that we move towards a stakeholder engagement and also the governance issues and how much women are actively engaged. So, Ms. Sonakshi, how engaged are women in the coastal communities in terms of stakeholder engagement and local level decision making?
In India, and especially when we talk about like developing nations, there is still a limited level of engagement and decision-making power that women hold. This is essentially due to not having financial independence, not having asset ownership. The land is still has a very patriarchal setup. We move from one male member to another male member is assigned the land. Women do not have vehicles in their names. There are no bank accounts. There's no access to mobility. So all this engagement and local level decision making is only empowered when you have all these ownerships on your own life. So while, especially in coastal regions, if we are talking about, the climate change has not only increased the frequency of events, but also the intensity. The entire coast of India is now prone, as Dhanushi mentioned, not equally, but it's still prone to sea level rise and is highly vulnerable to cyclones. These sea level rise itself exacerbates the impacts of cyclones, frequency and intensity of storm surges, coastal flooding. 3 of India's 5 mega cities, which are Kolkata, Mumbai, and Chennai, are situated in low-lying coastal areas, which are exposed to regular cyclones. And women living in these areas are inherently more exposed and are more sensitive, as we say, due to just the setup of it. So they have limited stakeholder engagements at whether it's community, whether it's local or subnational level, especially when men move out. When they are migrating outside, women are left with, they do not have the collective bargaining power. So when we talk about household decision making, it's already either dominated by men, and even during a disaster response, men have strong social networks, and they are the first to hear about forecasts of for there's a heat wave, there's flood, or there's cyclone, and are more aware about early warning systems and have information regarding shelters. This makes them more disaster prepared. So, and women are at a higher risk when a disaster strikes due to just lack of information. Just because they do not have that information makes them more vulnerable, makes them more sensitive. So to prepare women to have a better decision making and hold to have a better skill is when they are more aware about news flashes, emergency shelters, have a preparatory GIS for them, have access to solid communication systems. They should also, I believe, they should also have a freedom of movement. I'm talking about mobility of women here, that disruptions by these climate-related events such as cyclones they disproportionately affect women because they have less access to private vehicles. When the systems fail due to climate change disruptions, temporarily or permanently, women might face increased journey times, higher costs, and even lose employment opportunities due to unreliable commuting options. Women are mostly used to walking and affordable transport, yet less safe transport options, which are more hazardous, and thereby it jeopardizes their health. The structure of a women's travel is usually characterized by frequent short trips or trip chaining, as we call it. So it increases their exposure to these extreme weather events. So when you do not have asset ownership, when you do not have the financial independence, so thus your ability to have an engagement and to be in the community and have a strong opinionated voice, it also decreases by just this lack of system that is not there for you. So I think it is very important to build up these systems inherently in the society, so that women can have a stronger bargaining power. They can have a better decision making. They are more entitled to decision making at their own level. We have also known there are also studies where pregnant women also do not have a say to when they go for perinatal care or when they go for checkups. Forget about disasters when they strike. The whole healthcare system, as Dhanashree mentioned, is collapsing. So these are the borderline. These are some of the strong pillar holes which are needed to strengthen these stakeholder engagements and empower women to have better voices in the even community level. I'm not even talking about the national level yet. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Sanakshi. Now we'll move on to another question that also essentially deals with stakeholder engagement as well. So, Dr. Dhanashree, what role do men, women, communities, and local governments play in co-creating climate adaptation strategies that are gender sensitive?
So as Sonakshi pointed out, I think this is a whole of society, whole of government approach that we need. I mean, gender mainstreaming or gender responsive or even gender transformative, we need to move towards gender transformative policies as well if we are to tackle vulnerabilities seriously. And the reason why I say transformative is because that is what involves greater stakeholder engagement with both not just stakeholders but also rights holders. We are talking about women who have certain rights that need to be protected as well. And transformative because we need to address the root cause of these structural inequities, and not just of course you can create you can give social protection schemes to women that would protect their rights, but these will be still temporary measures because in effect you need to also ensure that women are empowered to take control of decisions, take control of their lives, and be able to have those decision making powers within the society they inhabit or within the local governments. And we have seen again that much of these local decision making has been dominated by men for a long time, and not just in coastal areas across the board, but definitely this is something that we need to address. We have certain regulations in place, like laws like 50% women-headed panchayats, for instance, is a good step. But from there we need to move towards like the power not being concentrated in some families, for instance. We need to move towards having a more decentralized approach, which would also give women of all classes, castes, age, and even women with disabilities, for instance, have that sort of access to power. So that involves greater stakeholder engagement, and the way in this can be achieved. Of course, there are some, as I said, one of the ways is to try to put gender as an important category in all state action plans on climate change in all the coastal areas. Some of the states like Kerala, for instance, have done a good job of at least putting it in paper, because that is the first step, to ensure that gender is mentioned across all the pillars of climate action. And this will also give some sort of priority towards gender responsive policy, climate adaptation or climate mitigation or disaster risk reduction policies. which will also empower some of these self-help groups. Like, for instance, Kerala has something called the Kudumbashree, which has a lot of, which has made a lot of efforts, especially disaster risk reduction, because Kerala has seen, all these different disasters since 2018, particularly a series of disasters, flooding, landslides, which have affected, again, we have seen how it affects women, and particularly, women, and also children, girls are affected much more by these disasters. And we have seen how organizations like Kudumbashree, and other women-led self-help groups have come forward to increase preparedness. And they are, of course, they are an extension of the state itself. They get support from the state as well to help deal with disasters. A lot of it is also about economic diversification is one. Sometimes it's about climate proofing infrastructure, because you don't want to end up building infrastructure in the same or your houses, you don't want to rebuild them in the same places where a disaster has already struck, or few disasters have struck in the past few years. And again, women should have ideally a lot of say in what how the decisions are made when it comes to where the houses are built, and how it will protect their rights, how it will protect the overall family welfare itself is taken care of. And some of the ways in which stakeholder participation, I feel, has already been carried out, especially also with the help of donor agencies, with the help of state governments or local governments, and also communities. For instance, it's participatory vulnerability analysis, for instance. That could be just the first step to understand what are the local risks, because we need to contextualize solutions and governance mechanisms, and not like have a very uniform sort of understanding, which is why I said state action plans would do a lot of good in terms of having these contextualized solutions, understanding the risks, and understanding the underlying vulnerabilities. And this is where local communities as well as governments could could work on understanding how housing, education, health, and many other sectors are affected. And women, involving women in this vulnerability analysis would also help understand the specific gendered vulnerabilities. So that is important. I think one of the important factors that Sonakshi also mentioned, like access to information, and much of the knowledge and capacities of women, for instance, have been ignored for a long time. That women are usually portrayed as victims of climate change, but also how women have a big role to play in terms of acting on climate change and leading climate action within their communities. Like I said earlier, that they have a big role to play in that. And it's not like burdening them with this additional responsibility, but the fact is that there is a lot of knowledge and capacity that needs to be also acknowledged and recognized when it comes to climate action. And this will happen only through a more and more like participatory approach to climate adaptation in the coastal areas. It cannot be done, just about top down, bottom up, local governments kind of outlining the activities that could help women cope with climate change, but it should be more participatory, so that these gender vulnerabilities identified by women themselves and also men, could be integrated into the policy making, and could be integrated into whatever actions are taken. So I've seen a lot of great examples of this already happening at the community level. In fact, even in Lakshadweep, for instance, drawing inspiration from Kudumbashree, there's something called Dweepashree. I mean, Dweep means island. And, again, this is also because, knowing the specific vulnerabilities of women on the island, again, the idea is to provide women, microfinancing facilities with low interest, that could also help women deal with, say, financial emergencies that could come from like a disaster, for instance, or, especially when the jobs are affected, or when as Sonakshi also mentioned, the economic independence is affected, so then it is these kind of women-led groups that could come together to also protect the economic rights of women at that point in time. So these are the groups that are, I think, have already done some good work, and these could, of course, this is still not enough. We need to scale them up. We need to ensure that, different stakeholders cooperate and coordinate with these groups in order to achieve the desirable outcomes in terms of, gender mainstreaming and gender responsive climate policy. I think this is the way forward, particularly focusing on building participatory processes that that would involve women directly in the decision-making processes, vulnerability analysis, etc.
All right, ma'am. So now we'll move on to Ms. Sanakshi. So women have traditionally employed various strategies to combat climate crisis. Can you name some of them while also providing examples of community initiatives? Are these addressed in the government policies? And what specific measures do you think the governments must take to integrate women's strategies into formal climate adaptation policies?
Thank you, Alina, for that question. I think I would like to go a step back when we talk about women's adaptive capacity and responses. We first need to talk about the impact of disaster per se when you talk about these responses. So mostly when we talk about a disaster, there are also roughly there are slum tenements or economically weaker section housings which are highly exposed to cyclones because of the poor construction materials and the structural design that compromises structural stability. Women residing in these substandard housing, especially in informal settlements, face heightened vulnerability to damage because of an extreme weather event when it occurs. These are poorly constructed homes, lacking flood resistance, and it leaves them disproportionately exposed to displacement, property loss, and also health risks. The aftermath of an extreme event also typically sees a spike in waterborne diseases and a deterioration in sanitary conditions, infrastructure, loss of energy access, which then affects women more who have low income or live in a low income household. So for sanitation, women then access as a response measure, unfortunately, to open defecation or public toilets post a disaster, and especially hard for older women and pregnant women. Many studies have also talked that experiences of a psychosocial stress due to sanitation, which varies from women to women, depending on their gender, their caste, degree of poverty, age, marital status even. It's also sometimes shaped by the geography of the slums, the specific characteristics of that location despite being a coastal region itself. So you have to talk about topography, infrastructure, kind of sanitation facilities which are already there, which got ruined. So the issues also vary according to health and seasonality. So there's a lot of, there's, as Dhanashree also mentioned, that there's a lot of gender-based violence. In fact, in one of the studies, it was noticed that there's an increase in emotional, sexual, and physical intimate partner violence post a cyclone or a disaster. But these climate adaptation efforts, now that the question that I'm coming to, which you asked, they often overlook the specific needs of the women, which actually delays their economic recovery and long-term well-being. So there are short-term recovery points and there are long-term recovery points. So traditional recovery usually focuses on large-scale infrastructure development post a disaster, and due to whether it's an extreme climate event even. So, and only values like high-valued economic sectors, neglecting small-scale enterprises which are there in coastal communities and agriculture rehabilitation programs, where these women from coastal communities are predominantly engaged. So there are many government policies and plans which are gender specific and need based when it comes to DRR, disaster risk reduction. Some of them, such as National Disaster Management Plan of 2019, that recognizes the specific needs and risks faced by women. There's also Swadhar Grah scheme. It's a housing scheme which offers shelter, legal and medical aid, vocational training, counseling, and social security support for up to 3 years. 5 years for those over 55 to deserted women and survivors of natural disaster. The master plan by Urban and Regional Development Plans formulation and implementation, URDPFI, has gender responsive urban planning, talks about transport sector, which it should be taken into account, and also women's participation in this gender decision-making process. There are also like Nai Roshni program, one step center scheme by Ministry of Women and Child Development, microfinancing, as Dhanashree mentioned, services program under the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh, also by Ministry of Women and Child Development, among others. Usually, women have appreciated and gained confidence when they have been direct beneficiaries of a disaster relief compensation. For instance, after the Nisha cyclone of 2008, women received funds for reconstruction of damaged houses and reported feeling more respected and less vulnerable. Not-for-profits like CARE and Mahila Seva Trusts are offering insurance products for to women to insulate them from climate change per se. We also need to focus on improved energy access and sanitation facilities, which are crucial in mitigating these vulnerabilities of women to climate-induced hazards. Resilient housing construction is a strong indicator of adaptive capacity, especially when you talk about disaster-specific resilient housing, for instance, heat, flood resilient, during and after both like slow and rapid onset of climate change events. One of the good instance of collective bargaining power, which has been entailed, is the Mahila Housing Trust, which is empowering women to build climate resilience in slums by becoming climate sathis or climate fellows. The models build upon the notion that if the urban poor are provided with necessary knowledge, tools, leadership skills, they will be able to devise and implement climate resilience technologies, solutions themselves locally. Like it will be a more sustainable adaptation. So through this Climate Sathi project, women are trained to be energy auditors, which then encourage households to switch to more energy efficient lighting, fans and cooling devices, and become grassroots level micro entrepreneurs, forming a women-led distribution network of efficient and off-grid products, which we call DRE as well. So women also encourage households in these programs to use building materials and technologies that reduce heat, thereby reducing the climate change impact. I personally feel sanitation is one of the missing program when we talk about DRR, especially for women. It's a big factor when we talk about women's responses, which are developed due to their adaptive capacities to climate change. Not necessarily, unfortunately, all these responses are positive in nature. Women store water in containers, buckets, and tanks to prepare for water shortages during heat waves, floods. They also collect rainwater or secure municipal water supplies before a disaster strikes, putting significant burden, physical strain on their bodies. They also cope. Personally, we all know this, but the women also cope by developing body discipline, that is trying to control bodily functions so that urination and defecation are infrequent, and they have and safe as possible. So getting out accompanied by other women, husbands, or a male member of the household, that also ensures women are safe, and they thus reduce their own vulnerability to accidental injury or sexual violence when they access these facilities. And ignoring violence and harassment as well. So instead of public toilets or open defecation, the best idea is to the goal, I would say, is to solve the problem of unsafe and insufficient practices. In slums especially, was to be constructing and owning an individual toilet. So these are the most basic sanitation practices. And if we talk about older women, pregnant women, younger girls who go unaccompanied sometimes and feel unsafe, so these are some of the good practices or the best practices that can be involved. And these community-led sanitation programs also empower local stakeholders, marginalized groups, women from other castes as well, different castes, and it drives behavior change, collective behavior change in the society. So there's an immediate need for gender responsive facilities, and it's important to ensure the sustainabilities of these interventions, that it should not be a one-time thing. It should be more long-term and be driven at the grassroots level.
Thank you, Sonakshi. So we have a question from our YouTube chat. So how does caste, class, and ethnicity come out impacts the lives of climate change on women's lives and livelihood in coastal areas? So it's in the YouTube chat. So both of you could comment on this. We'll start with Dr. Dhanasri.
Okay, yeah. I think, Sonakshi already mentioned these issues, and I also pointed out how intersectional vulnerabilities are important to address, because again, it goes back to the structural inequities. So when women of certain caste and class already don't have access, say, to decision making, to resources, to public facilities, for instance, that could be sanitation or even healthcare facilities where or water, for instance, access to water in many areas are also kind of demarcated based on caste, particularly in India. So this obviously increases the vulnerability of women belonging to the marginalized castes much more, or classes much more. Age is another important factor as well in this. So yes, that's how the structural inequities is what make women of certain communities even more vulnerable than say the middle class or upper middle class women. Um, and I just want to flip it a little bit because, like I've also seen, like I was talking to a friend of mine who works on, again, climate and gender, and she was saying, like, for instance, in Kudumbashree, for instance, until 2018, the entire organization was seen as, an organization led by women of lower caste or lower classes. That was the whole idea, that self-help groups means the women of certain communities. But 2018 floods kind of opened the minds of people that we need to change this thinking, because everyone was affected massively by the floods that happened in 2018, and that sort of opened the floodgates as well to a large extent. It kind of broke the glass ceiling that this is the self-help groups and all these different initiatives are not just for women of certain communities. And then we saw women of middle classes, for instance, also joining them in big numbers, because they understood the importance of this collective efforts and collective initiatives. Because at the end of the day, this is of course there are differentiated vulnerabilities, but it is a common problem as well that can be tackled through these collective initiatives. So I think there are ways of breaking these barriers. At the same time, before that, of course, we need to recognize them and act upon them in terms of the transformative capacity of women at all levels, because like knowledge and capacity does matter, and these are dependent highly on these kind of like structural kind of barriers that are put in place as of now.
Ms. Sanakshi, if you could comment on the same.
I think Dhanashree has pretty much mentioned everything. There was this one study which I read about, on the idea of caste and disaster and climate change. And, like the problem, I will not add much because, of course, everything has been covered under this. But when you cohabitate with other communities and other caste, there's always a scare of the other, the othering, they are not like us. They are not us. We are, so there are certain structural differences which come because of our own thinking or the biases that we have grown up with. So it's also important to break those barriers within ourselves when we are looking for community engagement. While it's very, very hard, and I completely agree, a lot of us belong to upper middle class where we are still these inequalities do not impact us, and we are very privileged, and we should recognize that privilege. But there are many communities which are not so privileged, and they still live in marginalized sections where this othering, the other caste or the other class or the other society or the other person is very, very present. So I think we also need to break those barriers by behavioral change campaigns, and we need to work together. At the end of the day, as Dhanashree mentioned, it's like the disaster strikes everyone, though disproportionately, not denying it. But the answer, the solution is to come up collectively, to work together towards it. So yeah.
All right. I think we have come to the end of the webinar. So before we wrap up, these are the following takeaways from the webinar. So starting with Dr. Dhanashree, she began with explaining about the various gender vulnerabilities that happens across climate and gender in coastal area, essentially in terms of agriculture, or maybe if you could look at gender-based violence, or economic issues as well, such as how women are also not, essentially recognized in workplaces. And also, Dr. Dhanashree had looked into how women have to, go through additional burden in terms of care work, or when you go and collect water, while also focusing on migration as well. And she also highlighted how climate migration is not something which is, studied that much in India, which must be something that needs to be studied. And also how, while also focusing on various initiatives from various states. For example, how in Kerala there is something called as Kutmasri, and how it has been helping communities. And she has wrapped up the conversation by focusing on the participatory approaches to climate change and why it is necessary to identify and integrate men into this as well. So thank you so much, ma'am, for your inputs. Now, moving on to Ms. Anakshis. I'm glad that you could draw on your experiences at NIUA while integrating this into this webinar. I liked how you integrated the cultural as well as financial aspects of the women and the issues they face in coastal areas, because this is something that is not really spoken much about. And also the focus on how men are usually the ones who learn more about early warnings when a disaster happens, and how the idea of disaster management is connected with sanitation in women, or also in terms of transportation. And Ms. Anakshi had wrapped it up with the need for NGOs as well as other agencies to help women in terms of their access to sanitation or their access to economic as well as welfare mechanisms. I thank our panelists for taking their valuable time out and sharing their expert viewpoints with us. And CPPR extends our gratitude to Asia Foundation. And thank you so much, Manvi, for joining us. And thank you, Asia Foundation, for supporting us in this project in building a network for coastal think tanks in India. I also thank CPPR team for organizing the webinar. And last but not the least, I thank the audience for participating in our discussion for the day. Keep following on our social media for more updates on our ICT project. With this, I conclude our webinar. Thank you, and wishing each one of you a great day ahead.
Thanks, Alina.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.